I'm Molly Vogt. In Texas, we need to talk. Our electric bills keep climbing, and it's not because power is expensive. It's because the cost of the wires that move electricity across this state has exploded. Transmission costs have nearly tripled in the past decade, and ERCOT wants to double it again. That could mean more than $13 billion a year for just transmission alone. Why is this happening? Because we have spent billions building wind and solar far away from the cities that actually need the power. Texans have already paid about $15 billion to connect those projects. And now ERCOT and the PUC want to spend tens of billions more on megalines that will stay on your bill for decades. That's not right. Texas should have the most reliable grid and the lowest prices in America. We are energy rich. We sit on the Permian Basin. We know how to power a nation. But instead, families are being forced to pay for long distance lines to back up energy that depends on the weather. There's a better way. Build reliable natural gas, coal, and nuclear close to where Texans actually live. Make developers pay for the lines they need. Stop rubber stamping projects that do not serve the people. Texans deserve affordable bills and a grid we can trust. That's why I'm fired up to bring on someone who knows exactly where the money's going and how to fix it. Dr. Brent Bennett, Policy Director at Life Powered with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. His latest research exposes the explosion in ERCOT transmission cost and lays out solutions Texas lawmakers need to hear. I'm Molly Vogt, and this is American Energy Works, the show that exposes how energy policy shapes our lives, our wallets, and our nation's strength. All right, well, Brent, thanks for joining me today. Let's start with the big picture. Texans are paying 3 times more in transmission costs today than in 2010, and ERCOT's current plans could double those costs again. What does this mean for the regular Texas ratepayer, and how in the world are we paying for it?
Yeah, thanks, Molly, for opening it up there, and it's a lot of it's an important issue to talk about given how much transmission is in the works in the planning process right now. It's kind of a big focus of conversation at the Public Utility Commission and out in the places where it's getting built. And we're hearing from a lot of people about the impact this is going to have, particularly here in Central Texas. So it's a really important issue, and it's important for all Texans because, yes, everyone pays for transmission. The way we pay for transmission in Texas is basically you have the cost of the projects that are built are uplifted to the system and then distributed based on how much your demand is at the peak. So during the peak hours of the year, every part of the system, the demand is measured, and then the costs get distributed according to that. So by nature, just by the nature of how the system works, residential ratepayers pay a little bit more because we use more peak demand. It makes sense because we residential ratepayers use our air conditioning more. That contributes to the need for more transmission, right? So that is, that's how it's been designed. That's how it's worked for 20 plus years, right? The problem now is we have a lot of large industrial loads that are coming into the system, and depending on how those loads interact with the system, how much demand they have, like if they have flat demand, which is how a lot of like traditional petrochemical loads are, those are great for the system because they're stable, they don't add to volatility. Yes, they pay lower transmission costs than residential consumers do, but it's a function of the fact that they're steady. But different demands that are different, AI data centers, stuff like that, very volatile demand could be very different. Cryptocurrency providers, they oftentimes can just turn off during peak demand hours. They pay very little transmission costs, right? Sometimes that's okay, but again, when we're building projects specifically for these types of facilities, and a lot of our new load is coming from these facilities, that's going to be a big problem. So it's that's basically how we end up getting from, okay, here's 3x transmission cost, right? That filters down into basically the transmission portion of your bill has risen from about 30 to 40%. So your overall bill, transmission is about 40% now. It was 30% 20 years ago. And that's, it's $15-20 per month more that you're paying now than, and again, that's set to increase again. So it's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Well, how much of our average bill is transmission versus the cost of actual electricity itself?
So the transmission part of your bill is about 30 to 40, has gone up from 30 to 40% now. That's transmission and distribution. So it's also not just the high voltage wires, but also everything that goes into, serving your house, right? That's about 40%. Energy costs are about another 30%, and then just basically like overhead and taxes and other stuff are about to another 30%. So the actual energy portion of your bill is about 30%. That's gone up too. That's another, we could have another episode on that. But it's actually gone up at a slower rate than the transmission portion.
Well, it makes me very nervous, and I'm glad we're having the talk because I know my electric rates have been rising a lot. And I'm hearing that from my friends and my neighbors as well. And I'm pretty surprised living in Texas that my rates keep going up. It seems to me like they should be going down because, American energy is being unleashed, and our president and the administration seems to be doing a lot to really climb back a lot of the subsidies and actually like unleash our energy again. But I don't know. I'm just wondering, what do you think is causing the explosion in the transmission cost here in Texas versus what's going on around the rest of the United States?
The policies being enacted now, rolling back some of the regulations, rolling back the subsidies, none of that's really taken effect yet. So we're not really going to see, the subsidies don't go away for another few years for wind and solar. And even then, you're still dealing with the impact of what we have on the system, right? Just because the subsidies go away doesn't mean that the wind and solar is going to go away. What exists still exists, and it's still going to be 50% of our installed capacity for a long time. So, on the energy side of things, we still have to deal with that. On the transmission side, there's been a lot of factors. One is just simple inflation. The inflationary and the inflation that occurred after COVID, all the money printing, that made everything more expensive, also made transmission parts a lot more expensive. And you combine that with the demand from new data centers trying to acquire equipment, demand from, there's a lot more wind and solar that, they have to acquire a lot of equipment, right? So all of that put together has just driven a lot of inflation. And then secondly, in ERCOT in particular, we had the competitive renewable energy zones, which are the transmission lines built in 2013 to bring wind from the Panhandle down into the center of Texas, right? That was a $7 billion project, but we pay that off over the course of 33 years. So we're still paying about $700 million a year for that project, and it's not just the capital cost, but you're talking about the financing costs. It's like a mortgage on a home. You got to pay financing costs, you got to pay maintenance, all those things. So every project that we do in Texas is paid off over 33 years, and it's not. And the capital cost is, say, the CREZ lines, for example, is $7 billion, but the all-in cost over that whole time is more like $18-19 billion. So that's So when you think about, you hear these numbers about how much certain transmission's going to cost, basically take that 2.5 times, and that's the all-in cost over 30-something years. So that's what you got to think about when you're assessing this.
Well, how much of this increase do you think is tied to like wind and solar being so far away, built so far away from where we actually need the power?
Our transmission costs this past year were about $5 billion. In 2024, probably going to be a little more than that this year, but $5 billion, and about $1.2 billion of that was due to specifically the CREZ lines and also interconnection costs for wind and solar. So it's about a quarter right now, and it's averaged about that for a long time. The problem is that now we're getting into a phase where we have a lot of demand growth. We have to expand the system, but we aren't able to, the market is not building dispatchable generation close to where that demand is. Because of all the wind and solar that we've built already, there's not the market prices are not such that we're able to build dispatchable generation close to where demand is. So, and there's other factors too, but that's the biggest one. And so that's therefore, as we grow the system now, that's driving the need for more transmission, where in an ideal world, we would be building dispatchable generation closer to demand as the system grew. So then, you wouldn't have to build as much long distance transmission, which is really expensive.
But again, that brings us back to, we could build it closer. We should be building it closer. And if we were doing that, we'd be building reliable, dispatchable energy that we have an abundance of here in Texas, being natural gas, coal, nuclear, things like that. But just the question again, since I get it that the subsidies are going to be pulled back over the next few years, but just in doing investing and looking forward, normal business people look at what's going to happen in the future and say, if they're going to start taking back our subsidies and we're not going to be able to, keep our business as it is, then why don't we as Texas start planning that way and say, we're not going to be having any more wind and solar built. And who knows how long the wind and solar we have is going to last, if it can maintain itself, if it doesn't have subsidies, can it really pay for itself? We know it relies heavily on subsidies. So don't you think it's time for us to start paying attention to building more dispatchable, building on what we have in Texas?
Yeah, the problem is that, our market, despite the fact that the subsidies are going away, our market still overpays for wind and solar. And we've talked about this a lot before. The fact that we only pay for energy and not for reliability, that's still a fundamental issue, right? And plus the cost of new gas turbines has gone up more than double. So even though you take away the subsidies, there's still the fact that gas turbines are now very expensive. So there's still, I think, just because the subsidies are gone doesn't mean that we necessarily stop building wind and solar, or we can just say, oh, okay, well, the market, even though the market design's flawed, things will fix themselves over time. No, we still have to fix the market design to properly pay for reliability, and so that dispatchable generators have the revenue certainty that they need in order to build into the future. Right? And I think right now there's so much uncertainty in terms of how much revenue is going to be generated, particularly in Texas, but this is true across the country. That you've got to make these big upfront investments. Can you pay for it? And plus, the data centers are and that's why a lot of the development is going directly to the data centers, doing direct power purchase agreements, because that provides revenue certainty. Particularly for something like nuclear that has a really high capital cost, you want to have, and it's a long-lived asset, right? You want to have a lot of certainty so that you can get that paid back. Your payback period's not 5 years, So I think that's the challenge that we face right now is how do we get that certainty? And I think if we fail to do that, then we're going to end up kind of always being behind the curve a little bit in terms of having enough dispatchable generation.
We need to make some policy changes because, like you said, we are overbalanced. Our market is not incentivizing reliable, dispatchable energy any longer, and we need to get back there. But we'll talk about that another time. But that's something that we're going to keep working on in Texas. But as far as just getting back to transmission cost, we've been socializing the cost in Texas because we're all feeling it. And like you said, we're going to have data centers coming in. We're going to have AI. We're going to have all these big industries coming in. And that's great for business in the long run. That's great for Texas taxes in the long run. But we want to make sure that the people that are using this extra electricity are actually paying for it, and that the groups that actually need the extra transmission are paying for it. Why is that socialized in Texas? How did that happen?
The PUC is discussing whether to change that policy right now. So part of Senate Bill 6 this last session was a requirement that the PUC evaluate the cost recovery mechanism for transmission costs, right? So that is being assessed right now. The reason we've socialized it over the last couple decades, ever since we created the market 25 years ago, is that for the most part you have growth occurring throughout the state, and there's a fairly even distribution of where you need transmission, and transmission was only being used to serve demand. And so if you have new demand that comes into the system, well, they start paying transmission costs, and so they pay for themselves, right? And the hope is that with data centers, this happens, right? We have so much. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether that will happen, but that would be the hope, right? And if they do, that's great. The problem is, we're starting with the CREZ lines, is we started spending a lot more money on basically using transmission as a way to either connect new generation or to solve reliability concerns that are caused by this uneven distribution of where generation is compared to demand, right? And that's mainly a wind and solar development issue, right? So I think that's where things have kind of gotten off track. And now we're in this situation where the market is not, because the market's not incentivizing the right kind of generation, the only tool that ERCOT and the PUC have to solve this, solve these reliability issues is just to build more transmission, right? Now, if they would actually get on the program as far as market reform, that would help. But in the absence of that, in the absence of the legislature taking more action in that regard, their only tool is transmission, is adding transmission so that we can move energy around easier. So it's kind of a funny thing. We've gotten rid of vertically integrated monopoly utilities in Texas 25 years ago, which is what most other states have. So in essence, we created competitive markets, but we still have this middle piece, which is transmission, which is still regulated utilities are managing this, and it's a very much a central planning process. We've in a way traded the problem of how to regulate these monopoly utilities with the problem of, well, how do we regulate transmission in a system where you have this huge mismatch between supply and demand, right? It's in a way it's a lot simpler when you have the monopoly system to just do things on one balance sheet. You're not dealing with all these different pieces, right? And so again, we're fans of the competitive market here at Texas Public Policy Foundation, but the way that we've designed it, the flaws in the market design have created a lot of complexity that's made this transmission planning process really difficult. And it's also made it tempting for policymakers to just use that as a means to solve the problems that they can't solve or refuse to solve out in the market.
Well, I'm glad there's somebody like you and TPPF paying attention to all this and going to these meetings to help share with us what's going on, because if the PUC and ERCOT don't fix it, maybe we can get the legislature to. But knowledge is power, right? So let's discuss the Permian Basin Reliability Project and the proposed loop of high voltage transmission that ERCOT's proposing between the major cities. The projects put together are projected to cost $33 billion, you said. How did this come about? Why are we doing it? And what are the problems with it?
And that $33 billion, by the way, is, again, the lifetime cost will be about 2.5 times that. So more like $80 billion per se. Over 33 years, right? Which it would be one thing if that was really necessary to meet demand growth, right? I mean, we need transmission to balance the system. The problem with this is that, again, especially the Permian Basin project is fundamentally a market design failure. I mean, the reason we have to build these lines is because we have 80% of the time out in West Texas, there's too much wind and solar. We have an overabundance of wind and solar. We've overbuilt out there. But then, maybe 10% of the time, there's not enough. And at those times, the facilities, right, those facilities out there need power. These oil and gas operations, everything that's getting built out there needs 24/7 power. And so that the transmission lines, again, are the only tool to solve this. But it's absurd, right, that we can't build more dispatchable generation in a place where gas is almost free, right? That's really so it's not so much the cost is not the problem. It's the fact that we really shouldn't need to build this. And I should also emphasize, there's a lot of local transmission out there that's needed to help facilities interconnect to the grid, to help move power around locally. What we're talking about is really the $14 billion piece here of the project is the import lines, the high voltage import lines. It's going to have huge impacts on landowners all the way across the state. I mean, these are hundreds of miles of transmission lines. There's 3 of them, and they're all run all the way from here in Central Texas all the way out to the Permian Basin, right? So those, again, the need for that is fundamentally driven by this fact that we can't build enough dispatchable generation out there. That should not be a problem.
When you're saying that even our oil and gas companies out there in the West that are using wind and solar, couldn't they use their own energy?
They could, yeah, but I mean, it's hard to do. It's very expensive for everyone just to build their own generation. And also there's a lot of issues with emissions limits and things like that in terms of environmental regulations, which hopefully that some of that pressure is being reduced by the EPA now. But again, there's still, there's a need for grid power for everything. Even though and to make everyone do it themselves would be very expensive, right? Data centers can do it because there's enough scale there, right? And you're building 500 megawatt facilities, right, or something huge like that. There's enough scale those guys can maybe do it. But if you're just, an oil and gas operator that's consuming 1 or 2 megawatts, it's prohibitively expensive to do that. So we need power out there. I mean, that's not the issue. The issue is that, we ought to be building, large power plants out there instead of having to rely on power from here, which isn't available all the time anyways, right? I mean, we're still, we're short of capacity all over the place. And the eastern portion of these lines too, which is still in the planning process, there's a lot of uncertainty there about how much is that really needed to serve demand growth, and how much of it is just about moving wind and solar around, particularly from South Texas, right? ERCOT has not been very clear about exactly that. And if you look at their forecasts, if you take less aggressive demand forecasts, this is something else the PUC is working on. It's very important, is our demand forecasting and revising that process, because right now, we're forecast to grow the system by more than 50% in the next 5 years, and that's just not going to happen. And we're trying to build transmission to meet that. And I think we need to slow our roll a little bit. And this is what we've been advocating for up there at the Public Utility Commission, is slow your roll a little bit, make sure we get these demand forecasts right, because if you lower the demand forecast a little bit, then you can oftentimes get a lot done by upgrading existing lines rather than having to build these big new high voltage lines, right? Of course, the transmission companies want to do that because they make a lot of money from it. ERCOT looks at it as, well, this is great for reliability. So there's not been a lot of pushback against that so far. But we as consumers need to look at it and say, look, this is going to be expensive, and really it'd be more effective to, first of all, to do this in a more phased manner. And second of all, to make sure that we're matching the transmission with the demand growth, so that as it's being built, you have people coming in and hooking up and paying for it, right? Instead of building it and then no one hooks up for 10 years, or it's underutilized for 10 years, and then all of a sudden, we're overpaying for an asset, right? And so that's, I think, we as consumers need to be out there making those points, and we can't just wait until they start building the lines. That's part of the problem now, is the Permian lines. Everyone's getting up in arms about that because all of a sudden the landowners are seeing like, oh my gosh, this is going to affect my land. I'm going to get my land taken through eminent domain. And it's like, well, that's terrible. But really, the planning process has been going on for 2 years. So we gotta, like, if you really want to be, if you really want to be a good advocate in this regard, don't come in at the 11th hour. Let's talk about this from the beginning and look at this holistically, and say, look, how much of this is really needed. If it is really needed, then okay, then there's got to be some process for doing that. I think that's the question that a lot of people have right now, is they're coming in at the 11th hour and like, wait a sec, they're building all these huge lines. Are they really needed? What was the process for, deciding that these were needed? And I think what we're finding is that there's a lot of things that changed since they made that decision, a long time ago, and that, like, we need to have a reassessment.
Well, a couple of things on that. Like you said, a lot of things have changed since they made that assessment. So I want to take a look at like what the CREZ project taught us, and is there anything, lessons from that we could use now? And it sounds like you are kind of pulling a little bit from that, but then also just going back to the fact that you said this demand may or may not come, and if it doesn't come, or if it takes 10 years or so to come, we are socializing the cost. We, the individual ratepayers, are socializing the cost of building these transmission lines, taking eminent domain, taking land from people that we may not really need to even take for a guess. So how do we claw that back? How do we, the people, help you, Texas Public Policy Foundation? What do we say to the PUC? What do we say to the ERCOT? What do we say to legislators? What do we need to do to make sense out of this?
We have a very robust planning process. And so right now what's going on is, as the lines are being routed, There is a process. There's it's a regulatory process, the Public Utility Commission, where each line has a certificate for convenience and necessity, right? So the idea is that they have to prove that this is the most effective routing and that the line is needed, right? So there's kind of a bit of a back end review process. That's going to be happening over the next year, and it is possible to either downsize or even eliminate lines in the process and through this process, just because it's been, the big plan has been finalized and we spent 18 months doing that, doesn't mean that it can't change. The CREZ line, one of the CREZ lines was actually eliminated through this process back a long time ago. So that there's a precedent for that. And there's no statutory obligation that the import lines get built. Like the CREZ lines, that was like statute said we had to build a certain amount, right? All the statute says is that there needs to be a plan for improving reliability out in the Permian, right? And basically facilitates the planning process for that. It kind of speeds that up, right? By creating one big plan instead of a bunch of little plans, right? That was basically what the legislation did. So that I think that we can use this back end process to try and assess that a little more carefully. And again, we haven't approved any kind of plan for the eastern portion. It's just kind of there's drawings on a map. But there hasn't really been any formal planning done. And I think that we should reassess that as well. We can get out ahead of that a little more because that's going to impact a lot more people. So a lot more populated areas there that those lines are going to go through. So if you think, again, if people, speak up to their legislatures, talk to the governor because governor is kind of the conduit for constituent feedback to the Public Utility Commission, right? He appoints the commissioners. He has a lot of influence over basically giving the public a voice here, and the public can also go and directly comment on these CCN proceedings. So there's things you can do there to make it known, like, hey, it would be put some political pressure on them. Make it like, hey, this is, if you keep going through with this without assessing it more carefully, then there's going to be a lot of political blowback for that. And I think that we're already seeing that, and legislators are starting to get more aware and start to pay more attention. So again, it's very late in the process, but there's still time because we have a very robust review process. There is still time to do that.
Okay, so talk to the governor now, and legislature doesn't meet for another year. So can we still be reaching out to our legislators right now? And you say before you agree to another $30 billion transmission project, we tell them here's exactly what we'd like you to do is run some more numbers and don't go so quick.
And the legislators can weigh in too. I mean, they can submit letters. Actually, one of the bill that started this whole process was House Bill 5066 in 2023, and the author of that, Representative Guerin, just submitted a letter, asking for, the PUC to, basically take certain precautions in terms of the routing and things like that, right? So like, and the PUC listens to that. ERCOT listens to that because they know that, the legislature doesn't meet till next year, but it's not like the lines are going to be built. They're not going to start building them by this time next year. The legislature could still come in and weigh in differently in 2027 if they had to. That's kind of a last resort, right? You don't want to necessarily have the legislature like coming in at the very last minute to change things. It's just going to make it more expensive. It's usually what happens. But if it's, but that kind of pressure then, and legislators signaling from their constituents what they want, right? That's how this process can be, adjusted on the fly, right? And while we're doing this review over the next year, if the PUC is hearing from a lot of people that we need to do things a little differently, then they'll take that into account.
Good. Well, if there's one thing we're good at is getting our grassroots activated. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to reach out. So in addition to talking to our legislators about thinking this through and doing more testing before $30 billion in transmission projects, last thing I want to ask you is what changes can we be asking to make to the ERCOT market design to encourage more dispatchable energy being built near the areas that we actually need the energy, rather than going all the way out to far west or far east?
Yeah, the governor said it 4 years ago and hasn't really been done, which is, making sure that wind and solar pay for the reliability costs they impose on the system, right? So we have a rule for that going through the PUC right now. It's going to be finalized in a few weeks, but that's only for new generation, right? And you and I and Jason, we worked on Senate Bill 715 this past session to try and expand that to the whole market, and that did not pass. The legislature has kind of signaled that they really don't want to do anything else in terms of market reform. So that that attitude, I think, is what we have to overcome. I think legislators have to understand that unless we fix the market, this transmission issue is just going to grow. The $33 billion is just the first installment of what's going to be needed, especially if we get as much demand growth as is being forecast, right? This is just, we're going to need, it's going to come back in another 7-8 years with 50 billion worth, right? And so on, right? I mean, I'm kind of exaggerating for effect here, but you see what I mean? Like it's like that. So I think that's what we have to impress upon people is that, look, we have to value reliability correctly in this market, and we have to do it it has to be across the whole market. These little ticky-tack, not that the rule is not important that they're doing right now. I mean, it's important from the standpoint of setting a precedent and testing what's really needed, but it's only going to apply to new generation beginning in 2027. So it's a really small subset of the market that's going to apply to, and so that's, I think we've got to think of something more holistic for the whole market. And there's a lot of studies being done. There's the PC and ERCOT have a study right now on market design. They're looking at the Dispatchable Reliability Reserve Service, which is an ancillary service to kind of help incentivize dispatchable resources. Like, there's a lot of things that are kind of around that we're talking about, but we aren't really getting at the core problem of why are we overpaying wind and solar and underpaying dispatchable resources. And we got to attack that problem and figure out the right way to implement a program that values resources correctly.
Very odd for me looking at the fact that during Storm Uri, I think our wind and solar installation on our electric grid was about 33% or something like that, and now it's over 50%. So we kept going away from reliable energy since Storm Uri. We haven't gone towards more reliable. We've gone away from it, which is insane to me.
Right. The amount of dispatchable capacity on the system is about the same as it was 5 years ago going into the storm. All we've done pretty much since then is spent $50 billion mostly on wind and solar, $50 billion on solar and batteries primarily, which is not going to help us much during the next winter storm. So until we fix that imbalance, it's not that we need to stop investing in those resources entirely, but just fix the imbalance, get it so it's a little more balanced, and that will help a lot.
Well, we'll be working on that. Dr. Brent Bennett, thank you so much for all your information and for raising our energy IQ, all the research that you're doing down there, and talking to PUC and talking to ERCOT and talking to the legislators. And thank you to everyone else that's listening. We have the energy, we have the resources, and we need the leadership to match it. But this is the way we make changes as we talk about these things. And now we're going to activate the grassroots. So thanks so much, Dr. Brent.
And we'll be publishing a paper on this transmission issue in a few weeks. We'll be writing about it. So visit lifepower.org for more information.
Cool. And then we'll post it as well on American Energy Works.
All right. Thank you.
Texans have been told for years that wind and solar are the cheapest way to power our state. But look at the results. From 2020 to 2024, residential electricity rates in Texas have jumped 28%. Wind and solar in ERCOT are 5 to 10 times more variable than natural gas, coal, or nuclear during peak demand. And that volatility has cost Texans $2.3 billion in 2023 alone. These costs are supposed to be paid by whomever causes them. Instead, they're being pushed straight onto the backs of we, the Texas families. And while we are paying more for instability, ERCOT's transmission plans could double cost again because we keep running these long distance lines to chase wind and solar in distant regions. It's time to stop this. Texas should build reliable power where people actually live. Texas should cut unnecessary transmission. And Texas should put people first and build a grid strong enough to power the greatest economy in America for generations. Dr. Bennett, thank you for raising our energy IQ. Texas has the energy. Texas has the resources. Now we need the leadership to match it. And thank you to everybody for listening to American Energy Works.